we've been talking about grievances versus resources as, the critical driver of civil war, but it's worth pointing out that political scientists who study civil war, who are probably more on the international relations side of things, where they're interested in war and guns and violence, came to that debate in a kind of a roundabout way. They really were piggybacking on an earlier conversation that was happening within the social movements literature that was interested in protest movements that might occur within a state. And they got to that point of thinking about this question of resources through a statistical analysis. And around, I think, 2001, James Farron and David Layton published a paper where they were looking at various possible explanations of civil war. And they came to the conclusion that really civil war happened when there was an opportunity for there to be a civil war. And that opportunity was really the only factor that made any sense. A few years later, David Collier, who's coming from the economic side and was working with the World Bank, essentially ran the same analysis with the same basic data and reached the same basic conclusion. And the book that we use for this course is Collier's book. And so, you'll see him walk through this sort of this process of discovery. But it's worth pointing out that he's really replicating some work that was done by James Farron and David Layton, almost a decade earlier. And they had really sort of pushed that conversation forward to thinking about civil war not as something that results from grievances, but something that results from opportunity. And so in order for that to, I think, make any sort of intuitive sense, I think we need to maybe have a conversation about what we mean when we say causal relationships and what causality actually looks like. And so the way that I tend to sort of introduce this idea of causality is with a story that was developed by Richardson, a guy who's interested in arms races. Richardson told a story about, okay, so you have a detective who's looking at a person at the bottom of the stairs who's fallen and died, and they're trying to deduce sort of what happened to cause this person to fall. And, one piece of evidence that they come up with is, well, the person smells of alcohol and possibly was drunk. And then another clue is that, well, it was raining, and so it was slippery, and it was dark, and so it was possible that this person was, inebriated, navigating, slippery steps, and in the dark, and fell. So the counter argument, of course, is gravity is the reason why it happened, right? Can't get that story without gravity. Gravity has to be part of the story. And then somebody comes along later and says, wait a second, I think last night there were some kids who were shooting off fireworks. And so the story we end up getting is one in which there is a general cause, a big structural force that's responsible for something happening. Gravity. That's why this guy fell down the stairs. Gravity makes that happen. But gravity is always there. It doesn't necessarily always yield that outcome. And then there were risk factors, right? There were things like it being dark, it being slippery, the guy being inebriated. All of those things make a fall more likely to happen, but don't guarantee it, but should probably be part of that story. And if you don't have any of those risk factors, gravity might not be doing anything. At least not in terms of, well, gravity will be doing things. It won't be making people fall. But then there's also the fireworks going off that may have startled the individual. And that might be sort of the proximate cause, like the triggering event that sort of puts all those risk factors into motion and allows for that general cause to sort of do its thing. And so when we're thinking about why do things happen in causality, we can tell these stories. And we oftentimes focus on those triggering events, but those triggering events may not actually matter all that much. They only matter when the general cause is in the background, when the risk factors are such that that trigger can actually ignite something. And it turns out when we start looking that just about anything can be a triggering event. Triggering events are found all over the place, and it's actually those risk factors that end up being really the deciding factor in terms of thinking about why we see things like civil war happening. Okay, so if that brief discussion about causality makes sense, we can turn to some of the things that Collier and also Farron and Layton have discussed as risk factors. Poverty has been noted to be a risk factor because states that tend to be poor tend to be more likely to have civil wars. Economic growth reduces risk as states grow and gain growing states, GDP per capita increasing, seems to reduce the likelihood of civil war. And then finally, Collier particularly notes that the greater the percentage of a country's economy, and I think he even looks at like exports, are based on natural resources or commodities, the more likely a country is to have a civil war. Now, it's a little hard to sort of tease out what's going on here because poorer countries tend to be more likely to to export commodities. And so this might just be like doubly capturing poverty. But the case that he makes is that commodity prices are very volatile. And a country can be flush with cash one year, and then the next year is sort of going to crisis and cutting things left and right. Coming from the state of North Dakota, we've experienced this over my 15 years here, where oil prices will be booming one year, and there'll be a record investment in higher education, and then 2 years later, things are cratering, and there's cutting across the board, and it gets very painful, and we go, a decade without raises. And those things can flip very quickly as commodity prices change. And so we'll talk about this, in a subsequent conversation about why that radical swing, or the potential for that radical swing in the capacity of a state or the resources a state has available, can really create openings for civil war. In terms of societal factors that might be risk factors for civil war, Collier thinks that religious or ethnic diversity is an important factor here, but Farron and Leighton don't find that relationship. And as we've seen in earlier discussions and in earlier empirical investigations, trying to pin down levels of violence with levels of diversity or different measures of ethnic groups within societies, the patterns are messy at best. And so I'm not entirely sold that you can make a strong case for ethnic diversity as a risk factor for civil war. You can, however, make an argument for demographics, and Collier points out that the larger the share of young men in society, the more likely that society will experience a civil war. That young men tend to be, I don't want to say dangerous, but I guess that is the implication of Collier's finding, that age cohort of young men that are of military age but are not maybe tethered into society. They're maybe not married with kids and a job and working a 9 to 5. There's that sort of freedom and latitude that makes them potentially a right pool to recruit for military service or for rebel groups. And so that's a factor that Collier finds. He also finds that the size of a country in terms of population matters, that large countries experience more civil wars than small countries, which I actually think is kind of intuitive, right? If you have 1,000 people, the odds that you're going to get, somebody within that group of 1,000 that has the skill sets necessary to launch a civil war is going to be pretty small. But if you have 1 million people, the odds of finding that kind of movement entrepreneur is going to be much bigger. But interestingly, Collier finds that it's not like just a linear straight line relationship, that adding additional 1 million people increases your risk of a civil war by the same amount as the previous 1 million. What he finds is that there's sort of a diminishing effect, so that yes, countries like India will experience more civil wars than countries that are smaller in population, like Sri Lanka, but with a rising population comes economies of scale, and so states become able to suppress nascent militant activity more easily. And so while you get more, it's not nearly as many civil wars as you would get if you took that same population and broke them up into 20, 30, 40, 50 different states. You'd end up with collectively more civil wars. Oh, that's kind of not an easy to explain pattern, but it's an interesting one that I think is maybe offers some insights to why we see civil wars in regions that have relatively small countries and relatively small populations, specifically sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, geography. This is another one that I think is there's some really interesting things. So mountains end up being a important driving factor in whether or not a country has civil wars. Mountains are a risk factor for civil war. The greater the percentage of your territory that's covered by mountains, the more likely you are going to have civil wars. Mountains are hard to control. They provide great hiding places for rebels. Just simply having mountains available for rebels increases the possibility that their rebel group will survive and be, I don't want to say successful, but at least able to conduct enough operations to be counted as a civil war. Neighboring states also help. The risk of foreign bases also creates an opportunity, but we don't see a lot of effect from forests. That greater forest cover seems to not have the same effect of mountains as increasing the ability of groups to hide. And when we look at urbanization, the results seem mixed. I'm not feeling confident enough to be able to talk about urbanization as a risk factor one way or another. This ends up being important because there's been some speculation by David Kilcullen, among others, that the conflicts of the future are going to be primarily based in cities, as we get sort of mega cities emerging and developing countries undergo increasing urbanization. I think the data is pretty mixed on whether or not increasing urbanization is going to increase conflict. So I'll put a pin in that, and we'll pause that for now as a possibility that we can think about. And then finally, there's no clear relationship in Collier or Farron and Layton's analysis between democracy or authoritarianism and civil war. And Collier and Farron and Layton get to that conclusion in different ways in what they see. Collier has sort of an interesting finding that democracy actually increases the risk of civil war for countries with low GDP per capita. But once you hit about 4,000, probably that would be about $5,000 GDP per capita, the effect of democracy switches from being more destabilizing to being less destabilizing. And in fact, after $4,000 or $5,000 GDP per capita, democracies tend to be much more stable than authoritarian regimes. And so it seems like there's some sort of flipping of the relationship that happens at that certain level of development where democracy suddenly switches from being a net negative risk factor to a net positive risk factor, positive, reducing the likelihood of civil war. Farron and Layton look at that in a slightly different way. They note that the democracy authoritarian measures don't necessarily tell us a whole lot about the likelihood of civil war, but they note that anocracies, which is kind of a weird term, but refers to countries that have sort of a mix of authoritarian and democratic institutions that are kind of maybe in a moment of transition, that those regimes tend to be more inclined towards civil war. That full democracies or maybe fully repressive authoritarian regimes seem to be less likely to experience that civil war. But though that anocracy category of kind of mixed regimes is really dangerous. And then finally, there's no clear link between having sort of a colonial history and having civil wars. However, we found when we dig some interesting differences for many decades after the end of the Cold War and decolonization. Former French colonies tended to be more stable than British colonies, particularly in Africa, and former Portuguese colonies tended to have been a disaster. So the effect or the relationship between colonization and whether a country is prone to civil war seems to be less about the experience of colonization and more about the post-colonial kind of relationship that's been put in place. And so in particularly contrasting French and British colonialism, for much of the post-World War II period, France really didn't care how their colonies were governed, whether it was by a military dictatorship or a civilian dictatorship or a democracy. The only thing that really mattered was that regime remained firmly pro-French. And if it was pro-French, it had the support of the French state. And if it wasn't pro-French, there was a good chance it would be toppled. The British Empire took a slightly different approach to its former colonies of trying to work them together into the Commonwealth, maybe encouraging democratization to some extent, or at least discouraging massive human rights abuses, and that may have may have opened the door for more conflict to resist those states, because there wasn't sort of a knee-jerk, we will back you militarily as long as you're pro-France response from the French state, which may have been stabilizing for a number of decades for former French colonies. That relationship seems to have dissipated after the end of the Cold War in the 1990s. So again, we're getting at this idea that there are lots of different factors that may increase the risk of a civil war, and those are important to understand because there's more or less an infinite number of possible triggering events. Just about anything could spark a conflict, and I think we saw that with the Arab Spring, where very unlikely events in different countries were the triggering events that sort of set off mass protests and mass demonstrations, starting in Tunisia with the merchant who set himself on fire. I don't think anybody anticipated that that would be a triggering event, but I think we could say that the Tunisia as a society was ripe for upheaval because of various different risk factors and yeah, various different risk factors. And if it wasn't that triggering event, some other triggering event would have come along and probably set the fire and ignited the powder that was waiting.